Right. There's still some more people coming in the room, so find a seat, and then we'll get started. It's great to see a lot of people in this room, because this is probably one of the least technical talks that you'll attend this conference, but hey, welcome. I am not an historian, so I'm here to talk about the evolution of video games. I'm not a historian at all. I just love playing video games a lot, too much actually. And I'm a coding architect at CBI in Belgium. So that's my technical background. I have another talk tomorrow, which is way more technical than this one, but let's get started with this one, because I have about 100 slides and only 50 minutes to do so. Now, when I ask people, what is the very first video game that you know, the oldest video game? Most people will answer with, indeed, because I put it in the slide title as well. But it's not Pong. Pong, however, was the most successful arcade game, the very first successful arcade game that was released to the world, which is why most people remember Pong being the popular or the very first one that came out. Don't get me wrong, it is old. This one was released on November 29 in 1972 already, which is 50 years ago. And if you look at how it's built, it's not using a micro CPU, it's not reading some code. It's actually built by a lot of logic gates and transistors and 555 timers, just plain old electronic logic. And the board that you see here is actually already a newer version of that game. The original game had way larger logic boards. This is already a reduced size of it. Now, if Pong was not the very first video game, which one was? Well, already in 1947, so this is almost over 60 years ago, two people, Thomas Goldsmith Jr. and Ethel Ray Mann, they thought of a game concept using digital electronics, like, again, those resistors and transistors and whatever. And they just thought of the idea and tried to patent it. So they actually didn't build it to produce it so that you can buy it and play it. They only had a patent for the idea. And the idea was to have a CRT screen, a cathode ray tube, an oscilloscope to generate the signals, as you can see here, and then analog controls to have the input. Now, this is what it could have looked like, but this is an AI-generated version of what it might have been, because there are no images of this device. The very first real video game, however, came in 1950, so 3 years after that patent attempt. And this was something that used light bulbs to visualize the play field, which is why people still refrain from calling it a video game, because it's just using a light bulb. But it did have real electronics in there, and this is called Bertie the Brain. It's a game of tic-tac-toe, which you probably all know, where you have to have an O or an X and then 3 in a row to win. And this was built for an exhibit in Canada. And it was demonstrated there actually to promote a new invention. So the person who invented this machine used it just to demonstrate their invention of the Aditron tube, which was a smaller version of the original vacuum transistor tube. This thing was also very large. It was about 4 meters tall. And here you can see, it's a little bit blurry, again, old pictures. This is the actor Danny Kaye playing that video game. If you know Danny Kaye, you're older than me. 1 year later, there was another new game released to the world, the Nimrod, built by Ferranti. If you know that company name, they've been here for a long time already. And this was built in the UK for the Festival of Britain in 1951. Again, very large machine, almost 4 meters by 3 by 2, so big machine. And this one was designed to play the game NIM. Now, I didn't know the game NIM. At least I didn't know the name. NIM is a game where you have a pile, several piles of matches. For example, you have 5 at the bottom, then you have a row of 4, 3, 2, and 1. And every turn, you get to take one, from one of the stacks, you can take 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So you can choose how many you take from each stack until there are no more left, and then the person who took the last one loses or wins, depending on the rules. And this, again, just uses light bulbs to visualize the stacks. It was also shown in October of the same year at the Berlin Industrial Show before it was being dismantled. So again, this was just designed to show off their skills. It was not designed to become a commercial video game. This is actually a picture from a replica built in the Berlin Computer Spiele Museum. So you can still go to Berlin and play this game if you want. And now we come to the very first real video game, because this one uses actual real-time graphics, not the ones that we're used to today, to render the video game. So this is called Space War, and it was created on the PDP-1 computer, and that's a machine that still uses those large pieces of paper with holes in them to feed the program. And this was developed in 1962 by Steve Russell and a team of others at the MIT in America. And the game featured 2 spaceships that were in a dogfight against each other, and they were navigating around a star. So that star induced a gravity well, making it difficult to navigate because you were thrown into the star and then you had to shoot back and whatever. And this game was open source. So that meant that other people could use that code. And if I say open source, this is 1962. That means you could pick up your landline, call them, and then you got either a stack of paper with the source code, or you got a magazine with all the printing of the source code. So open source, these days it's easier. So in 1971, Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck created a prototype of an improved version of Space War called Galaxy Game, and then they created arcade cabinets for it. So you could play this game against each other on a machine with a joystick and some buttons. And this game, Space War, Galaxy Game, inspired many other games, like we'll see also, we won't see this one, but Asteroids on the Atari, where you navigate a small starship and then try to shoot incoming asteroids, was based on this game as well. As I mentioned, back then, this is the 70s, you had a lot of magazines, and then you could buy a magazine and it contained listings of code, and you can type the code into your own machine and then try to run the software that was in the magazine. So this is part of the listing. Yeah, it's small. It's also assembly, so this is a lot of code to type over. And this is a part of the code of Space War in October 1977 in Byte magazine. And up until now, you weren't even buying these things. These were, if you found one of these machines, they were in a cafe or a pub, and you could play the arcade games there. Now, we come to the first commercially produced video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. This machine was released in 1972, and you could hook it up to your TV, and it had an input box that you can see here with some knobs that you could twist and turn, and then it had all of the logic inside to play several video games. So it was also still not a microcontroller. This was still using transistors and timers and everything just like before to play very simple video games. Now, it does have multiple video games, and to switch between them, it used a cartridge. I'm doing this because if we say cartridge, we mean something that contains game logic. This simply switches the internals of the Magnavox Odyssey around so that it takes a different path, changing the logic of the machine. Because it doesn't have a microcontroller, it doesn't have a CPU inside. Which actually also meant that whenever they sold you a new game, you already had the game. They just sold you the ways to play that game on your machine. One of the games was table tennis. Looks an awful lot like Pong. And the Odyssey had 28 games in total, but most of the games were actually the same as the other ones, but they just used an overlay that you could put on your TV screen, and then that somehow changed the game for you. So instead of shooting rockets, you were shooting something else, for example. Meanwhile, because we had Pong in the arcade version, it was so successful so that Atari thought, we want to bring Pong to the home, the real Pong. And they created their very first video game home console, which you can see here. They designed this thing in 1974 by shrinking down that big board of logic back first to the smaller version, and then they reduced that one into a single chip, a large-scale integration chip called an LSI chip. This was the very first high-performing chip used in a consumer product. So thanks to video games, I'm just going to say thanks to video games, we have smartphones. Thank you. And this console could only play one video game. This was only for Pong, but still it was very popular because it was so popular in the arcade. The only problem is that Atari had a very tough time to get this to sell, so they actually partnered together with Sears in the States to market the device, which is why it's now called Telegames and not Pong. Well, Atari should have wanted to have their name on the top of the device, but they had to put it down there in the corners, and Telegames was the Sears thing. Atari only started producing their own version in 2 years later in '76. Now, this is all United States. There's another part of the world, in Asia, where there was a company based in Japan that was traditionally creating card games, and they moved on to tabletop games and electronic toys. And they saw that in the United States something was happening with the Magnavox Odyssey and the success that Atari was having as well. So in '74, they acquired the distribution rights of the Magnavox Odyssey to distribute it in Japan. But then they said, we're not only interested in reselling stuff, we want to do our own thing as well. And this is where Nintendo started working together with Mitsubishi to create their own very first console called the Color TV game. And they released this in 1975. And the Color TV game was one of the very first consoles that supported color games. Would be strange to call your console Color TV game and have black and white only. So again, they had, of course, a Pong version of the game. And this was a very big seller in Japan. This console only cost about 10,000 yen in that time. For comparison, the Pong clone called TV Tennis was released in Japan for 20,000 yen, and Atari also released their version in Japan, but because of import and everything else, they had to put a price tag of 25,000 yen. So this one was really popular in Japan. So popular, in fact, that Nintendo continued releasing several other versions of that console until 1983. Some of which created more games, some of which were very specific, like you see the one with the steering wheel, so you could play race games, or the other one where you could play Breakout. So that's the one where you have a paddle and you bounce off a ball to hit blocks to make them disappear. And in 1978, right here in Poland, I'm going to butcher these names, by the way, Elvro produced the Amprod TVG-10, and this console had 6 integrated games, 2 of which were only playable using a light gun. So this system already had like a light gun, like the Nintendo that you have downstairs here as well. And this console is also here at the conference. So that's, well, it's not really visible here on the slide. It's a black device, but you can see it in action at the lower level as well. And this is the first generation of video game consoles. Now we switch into the new world. These second generation video consoles are very different because now they actually have a CPU inside of them. And you get cartridges, not just switching logic around, but they contain ROM chips with game logic. And this one was the very first. Not a lot of people know this, but this one in 1976, produced by Fairchild Camera and Instrument, was a Fairchild Channel F. This was the very first console using a CPU and ROM games. Unfortunately for them, there was another company on their heels. Atari released their video computer system, VCS, better known as the Atari 2600, in '77. And Atari already had a backlog of some games. They already had a very big name by then. So this video game console flooded the market in the States. And the Fairchild, unfortunately, got lost in oblivion. Now, the very first games that were released for this console were, of course, we're now used to different graphics, so bear with me. These were very low resolution, simple games like Combat, where you had two tanks traveling around and then you can shoot each other. And then you had some walls in the way, so if you try to hit them and you hit a wall, you would lose. And you already had scores here as well. So that's also new. The previous games didn't even have scores. You just played the game and then you either won or you lost, and now you could have scores. In 1978, in Japan, there was a very new hit arcade game. And I have to read these names, I'm sorry. Tomohiro Nishikado from Taito had been playing Breakout by Atari. That's the game that I was talking about, where you have a pedal at the bottom. It was actually also a spaceship. And then you shoot a ball and then launch it to the bricks to destroy the bricks. And then if you had all the bricks gone, you won the game. Now, he played that game, and he was so inspired that, I can do better than this. What if I replace that pedal with an actual spaceship and replace those blocks with moving aliens? And that's how he came up with the idea of Space Invaders. And we all know Space Invaders. This game was huge. It took the arcade halls by storm and inspired many other games after that as well. And other than scores and high scores, this game had a very new feature in the video game history. You had lives. So when you started the game, you had 3 lives, and if you got hit by an alien, you lost 1 life. Lose all 3, game over. Have enough points, you gain another life. Very new for the video game world, and it took the game arcade halls by storm. And things were moving very fast now. So one game after another was being released, some in the arcades, some in the homes, and a lot of them became very large successes. So in the United States and in Japan mostly, they had very large halls decked with video game arcade machines. People were coming in, spending a lot of quarters in the machines and playing games after another. One of these games was Missile Command. So the thing was, people were shooting missiles at you, those are the lines, and then you had to shoot them from the ground to block them off. And this game used a trackball to choose where you're going to shoot. Now, the video game arcade devices, they were actually making so much money that they stopped working because they were full of quarters and pennies. They were full of coins. They couldn't take any more coins. They stopped working. So they had to empty them almost every hour. But after a while, that hour became 2 hours, and 2 hours became 4, and 4 became a day. Why? People got good at the games. In the beginning, they were hard and difficult, and as they played more and more, they started becoming better at the games. So yeah, that's a big issue, because now we're not making money at these games anymore. So Some guys started working at MIT, studying at MIT, but they found it too hard and they wanted to make money fast. So they went to the arcades and they saw this and they talked with the owners and they said, look man, we bought these machines. They were great at the beginning, but now they're not paying that much anymore. So if you could help us out, that would be great. And they said, well, can we lend one of these machines? So they took it back, they opened it up, they inspected how it worked, they reverse engineered the game logic, and then they started patching the game. So they started hooking up some other chips, they programmed some other ROMs, and then at some point they made the game more difficult. So they started selling kits to convert missile command into super missile attack, making the same game a lot harder. And they just sold that kit to every arcade hall, and let's say for a few $100, and the arcade hall installed it very easily, and the game was very hard again. People started playing again, and they got more money from the arcade machines again. They did not think about one thing, however. Atari owned the original game, and they weren't very happy that someone else was making money on Atari. So they sued GCC Technologies, the ones who built these ROM kits, and they eventually settled in court, and some of the guys at GCC actually started working for Atari. Another great game released in 1980 was Pac-Man. And the idea of Pac-Man came from Toru Iwatani, also in Japan. He went to arcade halls, and what he saw was, I only see guys playing video games. I want to see everyone playing video games, everyone enjoying video games. So, his words, he thought, what kind of games would women like to play? Maybe not where you have aliens or shooting people or something. And together with his team, he sat down for lunch and they had a pizza and they were brainstorming ideas, and then he took a slice of the pizza and then was like, wait a minute. Boom, we have our main character of the show, Pac-Man. And it was released in 1980, and this was the immediate hit. Everyone started playing Pac-Man. It became so popular even that this one was the first video game character that got its own merchandising and TV show. But also, people started getting really good at Pac-Man very fast because it only had a few levels, it only had a few level layouts. So GCC Technologies came in again and started working their magic and created a more difficult version of Pac-Man called Mrs. Pac-Man. And also another video game character that had their own comics and video series and everything. Now, in June 1982, Steven Spielberg released the hit movie E.T. And Atari wanted to have an E.T. video game to go along with the release of that movie. So they went to one of their developers and said, hey, we want to build a game for that movie E.T. Are you in? And they said, yes, I want to do this. Great, you have 5 weeks. And we're like, normally in that time frame, in the 80s, creating a game for the Atari, let's say it took 5 or 6 months. They only had 5 weeks. So the next day, they put him on an airplane to Steven Spielberg's mansion to have them have a meeting about what the game should look like. And Spielberg said, I want to have a game like Asteroids or something. And they said, that's not really E.T., you know. The movie is about something else, an alien trying to get back home. So we're going to make a game that's more aligned to that story. And they said, yeah, great, do it. So they only got 5 weeks because the game needed to be done already in September, because they needed enough time for marketing and production to get it in the stores for Christmas in 1982. And he tried his best. They actually went with the game back to Spielberg. He played the game. He signed off. He said, yeah, ship it. And it was a huge flop. Nobody liked this. It was a very strange game where you had to, you had a bar of life that started going empty when you started walking around immediately, and you had to pick up candy to gain more life again, and then you would fall into a pit, and then it had nothing to do with the movie, although they said they was going to create something that went along with the movie. Now, this was not the only problem back then. Back then, everyone was creating video games. Everyone that know a little bit about computers and electronics was creating video games. So there were so many video games flooding the market, most of which were simply copies of each other. So everyone that had a video console had enough. And they stopped buying video games in the United States. And it was so bad that Atari actually destroyed a huge number of video games in 1983, and they dumped them in a landfill, as you can see here. And not only the E.T. game, also other games. It was so bad that the video game industry in the United States was almost completely dead. And in Japan, there was no problem there. People were still playing video games, and Nintendo had just released their first cartridge-based console, the Famicom, or family computer. And the Nintendo's president said, hey, Nintendo of America, we want you to also release this console to your market. And Nintendo of America said, well, we're not really seeing a lot of sales right now, because Atari and E.T. and we don't know. It's not a good idea, especially not something like this. This looks too much like the Atari. But you know what? There's this other device that every home has now. Everyone has a VCR, a video cassette recorder, and then you can rent a movie or record something and then play it just by loading your cassette in the front. What if we make it look a little bit more like this instead? Which is what they did. So together with some design team, Nintendo of America came up with a brand new design of the same system, same logic, but instead of having a top loader one, they had a front loader one, which is also really bad because this one stopped working if you used it too much. But it was a huge, simple trick and a huge success. This console was an immediate hit in America and also across the world. We have one here downstairs as well. And so began the console wars. Because there was another company in Japan called Sega. And they were staying in Japan first, and they were originally creating jackpot slot machines. But they saw Nintendo and they said, hey, we can do this thing as well. So they created their very first console, the SG-1000, in 1983, the same date as Nintendo released their Famicom. And they released multiple versions of this machine. They had a Mark I, Mark II, and then they had a Mark III, which they called the Master System, which is one that we also had in Europe. This one had a Zilog Z80 CPU, a very popular CPU back then, also used in the Pac-Man arcade video games, and had the capability of using 64 different colors, of which they could show 32 on a given time on a screen. Now, this console had a very small game library because Nintendo was very smart. Nintendo saw the issues with the American market, with the flooding of the games and everyone creating games. And Nintendo said, not everyone is going to be creating games for our console. We are going to have a license model where you have to include a specific chip on the cartridge so that it communicates with another chip in the system, and only if those two work together, the game will launch. Eventually, some people found a way around that, but that's how they licensed the rights to create games for their consoles. And then they had also a form of quality control. They also included something called a non-compete clause. So whenever you license the game for the Nintendo console, you are not allowed to release it on another system. And Sega had a little bit of a problem because of this rule to create their own library of games. If we look at the games that Nintendo had at that time, some of the examples were Donkey Kong, of course. Popeye was a very popular game based on the Popeye cartoon. Mario Bros, not to be confused with Super Mario Brothers. This was also an arcade hit. They had tennis, a very first real tennis game, not with the 2 paddles. Duck Hunt, which you can also play downstairs. And of course, if you miss all of the ducks, you get that annoying dog that laughs at you. And of course, Super Mario Brothers, their mascot. And then Sega tried to gain more traction, and some of the games that they had were Alex Kidd in Miracle World. This was actually included with the console, also a big selling point for them. The Ninja, Space Harrier, a port from Sega's arcade game. Wonder Boy, they had also a movie adaptation, Rocky, and a very, very popular game also from the arcade, Outrun. That was one of the very first big race games that you could play on a console. And these games began to, the very first one were very simple, and you thought there was not a lot of difference with the earlier games, but they became larger and larger and had more and more information on them, so that they actually included larger ROMs on the cartridges and systems to swap banks so that you could load in more graphics and more data. And some of the games were becoming so large, like Mega Man 2, that it was becoming impossible to finish them in one playthrough. So these games included a system that whenever you got to a certain checkpoint, in the case of Mega Man 2, you destroyed one of the enemies, the bosses, you got a code. And then you could re-enter that code to continue where you left off. And the code was simply a kind of a system, a password as it were, that remembered which bosses you already deleted. For example, with this code, you already had destroyed several bosses and you only had 3 left. But that system didn't work for a long time because other games like Zelda, they kept a lot more state. You could have a number of hearts. You could have different kinds of weapons and materials. So if you would have to generate a new code for every change in that state, you would have like a nice book of codes, and you could not remember them all. So somehow, this game offered you a way to create save games. So that you started playing, you created a save game, and then whenever you did something, it was automatically remembered. The next time you powered on the console, you could continue where you left off. To do this, they actually included a RAM chip on the cartridge together with a very small battery to just give enough power to that RAM chip to have it remember the save games for you. And later on, that even continued to evolve to also include a timer. For example, the Pokemon games on the Game Boy, they had a clock so that your Pokemons continued to evolve even though you turned off the Game Boy. And what about games that need some way of random number generation? For example, if you have a role-playing game, you want to hit someone and do damage, it would be a bit annoying if you always did the same amount of damage. Or even worse, if you always received the same amount of damage. These consoles did not have a random number generator logic inside of them. They were not that advanced yet. So if you have a game, for example, this is Final Fantasy, the very first one, they included a large table with randomly generated numbers. And then when you start the console, they started a timer themselves. So they started just counting 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. And the moment you press start, that's the number of the first index that they will use in that random table. So that's how they use random numbers in that game. On to the next generation of consoles. Here we have the TurboGrafx 16, the Nintendo Super Famicom, or the SNES as we know it, and the Sega Mega Drive, also called the Sega Genesis in the United States, because of a naming dispute. Now, these ones are the main ones of this next generation, the 16-bit era. But there's also one from Philips. Philips and Sony created a CD spec together, and Philips used that CD spec to combine audio, video, and code to produce the CDI for edutainment, they called it. Was not that popular, this one. I remember someone having one of these. There were some pretty good games, I must say, really using that fact that you had real video and then some form of interaction. But this one was not that popular in the world. The same happened for this one. So the SNK created the Neo Geo. You might know Neo Geo from the arcade halls, because this was actually a home version of an arcade machine. You could slot in cartridges that would have also be used at the arcade, and those contained games, and these games were really, really powerful. This thing had not only a 16-bit, but also a 32-bit CPU and a 24-bit GPU. So these graphics that these consoles generated were way beyond the market that you had. Unfortunately, so was the price. This thing back then was about $650, whereas the Super Nintendo was only $200. So if you had one of these, you were very rich. Not a lot of these were sold. So TurboGrafx, also not that popular. There are actually two contenders remaining. We had Nintendo versus Sega during these console wars, and they kept the competition thriving. And they released a ton of very good games, and then Nintendo already thought, we want to, at some point, move some of the logic, not only the gaming logic, but also some extra hardware to that cartridge. So they already had the capability of producing cartridges with another chip, with another compute logic chip. In this case, the Mario chip 1, also called the Super FX, and this one could do 3D calculations. So this had a floating point algorithm in there to generate polygon graphics. So you had Star Fox, one of the very first 3D games. The problem was, well, that these cartridges, these chips were so expensive that Nintendo asked the developers, if you want to create a game that needs this chip, you have to pitch your idea first to us before you get the okay to produce these cartridges, because they were so expensive. But that worked. They had a lot of good games using that chip. And Sega said, what Nintendo can, we can do better. So they had their own version. They had the Sega Virtua processor, and they released Virtua Racing. And this game looked really good. It was a very nice game. But the problem was that this chip increased the cost of a cartridge by $100 per cartridge. So they actually said, this is too expensive, no one's going to buy this, and this was the only game released with that chip. Instead, Sega focused on adding other stuff to their consoles. So they had the Mega CD, or the Sega CD, to increase. They had another chip in there, so you could also combine video and better audio with your games. Also increasing further with the 32X. So another addition to your console, and this had two 32-bit processors, but it was so difficult to make games for that only a handful of games were released for this one. A big flop. Now the funny thing is, you can create the Tower of Power by having a Sega CD, the Mega Drive, and the 32X, and then you also need 3 power adapters to feed power to the entire thing. But it was possible. Now, Sega was not the only one experimenting with CD add-ons. TurboGrafx also had a CD add-on, and Nintendo was also thinking about having a CD add-on for their Super Nintendo system. And they actually went to Sony saying, hey, we want to combine our console with you and then some CD stuff, and Sony was in. Sony said, yeah, let's do this. So they started creating a PlayStation together, and then the PlayStation could play CD-based games, but also Super Nintendo cartridges, and then you had a full game experience. And Nintendo would provide the games, and Sony would provide the hardware. And then during the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony announced their SNES console that then both accepted super discs, the CD, and the cartridges from the SNES. But meanwhile, Nintendo was thinking, these guys at Sony, they're not stupid. seeing what they can do, they might cut us out of a deal sometime. So they actually went back behind their backs. And the next day at CES, Nintendo announced a partnership with Philips instead. And Sony was pissed. Sony was like, what the hell, man? You just, what even? And then they said, okay. Nintendo was kind of hoping that they would back out with their tail between their legs. And Sony was like, you know what? We'll make our own PlayStation. And that's how the PlayStation came to life. The very first PlayStation, without cartridge support, only CDs, was released not that far after and became a huge success. And Nintendo was like, shit. So they made a big mistake there. Now, I'm going to dive into the PC world. Mortal Kombat. Of course, this is not a PC game. This is an arcade game. I think everyone knows Mortal Kombat. It was very big. It made a huge impact, pun intended, because it was a fighting game that used, instead of other fighting games that were already existing, real people. They videotaped people that were fighting. Of course, they were punching air. But then they used those graphics rather than having drawn graphics or pixelated graphics, and it was very violent. There was blood on the screen. You could perform a fatality if you won, with detrimental effects for the other one's health. So this game was really popular. I mean, I loved this game. My parents, however, didn't like me playing this one. And the problem was that these games were just released. So when in that time, you could buy every game. If you had money, you go to a store, you could buy a game like this as a kid. And in America, they said, maybe we don't want to do this. Maybe it's time that we put a rating on these games, just like we do for movies, so that you have to at least have a certain age before being able to play games like this. So thank you, America, for not being able to buy violent games when you're 14 years old. But maybe that's also a good thing. Now, funny thing, the movie industry and the game industry, they kind of invent techniques to create more entertainment media. For example, in the movie industry, you can make sounds by having a cardboard tube and fill it with grains of rice, and then if you turn it, it kind of sounds like raindrops falling. Video games like these, I mean, you have to punch someone, and it has to make a convincing sound of someone's bones breaking. You're not going to record actual bones breaking. You have to find another way to do this. For example,
so all this stuff sounds really small now, but when we take it into my office later and start messing with it, processing it, pitch shifting it, distorting it, like it's gonna sound a lot different than this. It's gonna be really cool.
Can I try one?
Yeah, go for it.
I just
You killed it,
broke someone's
man.
bones.
You wanna move on to some different fruits and stuff?
Yes, that's
That one right
that's
there
the
was
stuff.
good.
Yeah,
that one
good,
right there. Yeah.
So yeah, that's how they do that, basically. And then on the PC world, we also have games, of course. We have, for example, Zork, a textual adventure game. These were our games in the past. Very much graphics, and input was just you typing something, and then I want to go north. Okay, now you see this. I want to go north again. You see something else. You have other games. This was a role-playing game. Somehow. You had hit points and gold. That's how you can see it's a role-playing game. But you had large machines like the Commodore with cassettes, so you could have a game on the cassette, and then you had to rewind it to the correct spot before hitting play, and then you had code loading, and then you could play Ultima, which was a real role-playing game. Still used textual commands, so that you had to say east, and then you moved east, but you could see yourself moving east this time, which was already an improvement. And then we had the game of games, Prince of Persia. This game in 1989 was so amazing. It had so fluent graphics. I mean, back then, this was unthinkable. I'm not going to show the video in the interest of time, but this person, this developer, he videotaped his brother doing all of these moves, and then traced them, inputted them in the machine, and that's how he used this. And that technique is called rotoscoping. If you know rotoscoping, it's also used by Disney to create Bambi, for example, or all the classic Disney movies where used rotoscoping. We also, of course, have id Software creating first Wolfenstein 3D in 1992, which is called the grandfather of the first-person shooter genre. But where there's a grandfather, there's also, of course, the father of the FPS, Doom. I have a talk tomorrow where I ported the source code to C# to demonstrate some stuff with low-level C#. And this game was actually one of the first where you could play against each other deathmatch games on an EPX network. Westwood released the very first, but not the very first, but the very first influential RTS game, Dune 2, Battle for Arrakis. The influential part is that you could interact with your units, and then you had a menu that you could use your actions. So things are moving really fast. This inspired games like Command & Conquer or Warcraft. SimCity, a very complex city management game, inspired very much other games like Zoo Tycoon, Theme Park, and of course, The Sims. Max Payne, the very first game. This did not inspire other games to use bullet time. This was stolen from The Matrix, but still, everyone knew that game, and it was very fun to play. Of course, we also have other games, and most people will know the next one, World of Warcraft. A very popular, still popular today, massive multiplayer game, but it was not the first massive multiplayer online role-playing game. Do you know the first one? No? This was the very first multi-user dungeon in Telnet. You could SSH into a machine and play a role-playing game using text against other players across the globe in '78. Of course, yeah, this is not very popular. This would be more popular, Ultima Online. You had Diablo 1 style graphics, but this was an online RPG. And a few years later, we had EverQuest from Sony Entertainment. There were, of course, many others as well. But nowadays, of course, these graphics are already quite dated. Nowadays, we have way more powerful video cards that can cost you a lot of money. Or you can have a PS5 or an Xbox or a Nintendo Switch if you like if you play games for the game rather than the graphics. Or a Steam Deck or an Aya Neo or whatever. And then you can play stuff like The Witcher 3. Awesome game. Horizon Zero Dawn from a studio in the Netherlands. Of course, GTA, Grand Theft Auto. Awesome games. But again, there are still games that don't need fancy graphics to be great. The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and the new one. Now, saying that you don't need graphics, if you do a lot of effort in the graphics and it matches the story that you want to deliver, you get Cyberpunk. That was an awesome game. Riddled with bugs in the beginning, sure, but still, very good game. But if you want to have more like a movie and a story mixed together, Ghost of Tsushima. If you like Japanese games, you need to play that one. And I had to include this slide because I'm from Belgium. Baldur's Gate 3 by Larian Studios is one of my favorite games. Of course, yeah, I'm also wearing the game Final Fantasy VII, which is one of the games that I played like 50 times already. Let me end with a few more things. Esports. People are coming together to watch people play games against each other. So in America, you could play Counter-Strike, teams versus teams. They shot at each other and they win huge prize monies. And people think that this is new. Nope. In 1989, they already had a Nintendo Championship playing Tetris. And you played on special championship cartridges. And if you won one of those tournaments, you got the gold version. And if you won one of the gold versions, if you still have one, if you sell this one on eBay or auction, you can get $10,000, $20,000 for that one. And I managed to go through my slide deck somehow just a little bit over time, so thank you for your attention and have a great rest of the conference.